Okay, so welcome to our first Cinema 4D scene for our logo forming project. So in this part, we're going to take a look at a couple of modifiers, because this is where we're going to explore ways of revealing a logo from what looks like nothing. Of course, that's not quite true, but we'll explore all that stuff in a bit. So we've got the scene here. Let's just have a quick look at what we have here. And we have the XP logo. I thought that was some good geometry. You know, you can use your own piece of geometry here. That's no problem. One thing I will say is that it would be good to have geometry that has been retopologized or has decent ordered topology. Just purely if you're following along, there's some parts of this that will actually use point order. We're not going to use it in the final project, but I'm just going to demonstrate some ways to cover this with particles, and it might help. If not, don't worry too much. I'll explain as we go along. I've got a spline version of that as well. We can explore exactly how the splines work and sort of how the intermediate points affect where the particles go and that kind of thing. And then I've got another sort of like an alternative set here as well, which is a bit of topography. That's just purely to kind of compare, or just to kind of demonstrate that we can swap out geometry nice and easily in our systems. Okay, so what are we going to do first? Well, in XP, we want to reveal this logo by either generating particles on it or attracting particles or covering the object in particles. And to do that, obviously, we're going to need some particles. We're going to need some modifiers to tell our particles where to go. And there's a few different techniques that we can go about this. Now, if you're relatively new to XP, I'll just give you a quick rundown. If I ever go and grab an X-Particles object, there are several places you can find these. There's the traditional way, which is probably the most straightforward way, is the menus. You just go up to the menus into the X-Particles menu, and then all the objects, the common objects like the systems, the XP emitters. I'm not going to go into detail on what each of these things does or is, but that's a bit more of a beginner's thing. But if you ever need to find them, they're in this menu and a few other spots as well. So you can see all the modifiers are in here. You could even break out these menus and dock them if you wished. I'm not going to have that. I'm going to just have it as normal. There's another way as well. We can add a system object to our scene, and we'll be doing this a lot later on. So you add a system object, and that's now in the scene. And from this system object, you can also add all of the XP objects. So you can see here, if you look at click on the top of the system, and you can see control modifiers. So if I add one, say a speed, it puts it in the correct null as well. So that's kind of handy. And you can even click on these subfolders as well, these sub sort of sections, and they also have the ability to add. So there's loads of ways to add them. There's another one which is probably my preferred method, and that's to bring up the Cinema 4D commander. Now by default that's Shift C, but you could always find it by going into your shortcut commands, customize commands panel. So whichever shortcut you've chosen, bring the commander up, and this is the advantage of doing it this way, is that all the X-Particles objects have the prefix of XP. So if I just type in XP, we get all of the X-Particles objects with the XP at the beginning of them. You can see it's highlighted there. Now, of course, XP will be included in a few other words in Cinema 4D. So we're sure to find non-XP objects. There you go. There's Espresso and Explosion Deformer. But you can see it starts filtering quickly all the X-Particles objects, and you can find them all in here. Obviously, you're not going to be able to find something by just typing the XP part. So we'd type XP, and then say we wanted Turbulence, which is a very common one we probably use quite a lot. You just do TU, and there you go, XP Turbulence. You just double click that. I've got it set that it will add the object after the one selected in the object manager. But if I deselect everything and let's just add an emitter, so XP emitter, that jumps to the top of the OM, and then you can just drag it into the system. Or there's even an option to use system sorting. So I just wanted to give you a quick where to find stuff if I go too quickly or you miss something. Don't worry, that you can always find these objects in the menus, via the system object in its nulls, or via the commander. Nice and straightforward. So let's strip this back and let's just add a fresh system from the beginning. And we're going to start working on a way to build our logo up from nothing. So I'm going to reveal a few different ways to do it. So first of all, let's add a system like we had there. And let's set this system up. So when you add a system to a scene, Generally, I like to have some defaults set, but I'm going to go from scratch here. So this is the default that you'll get when you install XP. And I like to turn the icon in the viewport off. That's just a personal preference. I find once you add a few other modifiers and things, it can get a bit cluttered. You could even scale that down if you just want it there. It can be quite useful if you've got multiple systems in different locations, so it's useful as that. But I like to turn it off personally. And then I've got this only modifiers in the same system and only deformers in the same system. Now I like to check those both on. And what that means is that any modifiers that are going to affect this emitter have to be inside this system. So let's just add one just to demonstrate. So you see we're on the modifier stack here, motion modifiers, add a turbulence. If I press play, I'll just change the display of the particles as well. So click on the emitter. Display, change it to squares. There we go. And if I drag it out of the system, they will no longer affect the particles, as you can see. And this allows us to have multiple systems in the same scene, isolated from one another. And that's really, really useful for multiple, if you need different kind of effects within the same scene, but you don't want them to interfere. Okay, so enough of the basic stuff. Let's get into the actual project. And we're going to want to use some modifiers to form the logos or to kind of attract to the logos. So let's reveal this logo for a minute and let's just change the color so it's like a dark, let's do a gray color. There we go. It'll contrast the particles nicely then. And what we'll do is we'll move the emitter away and we'll make it much smaller. So go to the object tab. I'm going to change it to a circle. There we go. I'm going to make it a bit smaller so it kind of really shows off this effect. Move it back a bit. And we can leave it on the defaults at the moment. We'll probably add more particles, but you can see I'm just firing them off and the initial state conditions of the emitter, so the emission mode, the birth rate, all that kind of stuff, we've left at default, but that's what the particles are obeying. So they're moving at 150 units per second. It's a birth rate of 1,000 particles per second. And yeah, it's at default state. So we need to now modify these particles. So we're going to go to the modifiers. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a cover modifier. And that comes under motion modifiers. So let's go into here and grab cover. Now you can see this list is quite dense. So that's where the advantage of if we just searched for this would be. So if I actually do that, if I go to our commander again, pop that up, XP, and just start writing. You don't have to write the full word and it'll filter. And there we go, we have our xpCover. And I'm just going to drag it into our modifiers null there. Now, it's currently set to do nothing because we don't have a target object. And you can see, pretty straightforward, it's going to need a target object to look for. So what we'll do is we'll drag our XP logo SDS in here. And if I just press play now, you'll start to see an effect. And if I hide the object, you'll see it starts to form the logo. Now, we're clearly going to want more time for this to form. So let's give it some more frames and let's give it some more particles as well. So if I press play, let it go, and you can see it starts to build the logo up. And what's happening is the particles are just going to a random spot on the surface. If we look at the settings here, we've got the mode is velocity, and I'll explain that in a minute. But the main thing we're looking at here at the moment is this, we're cover filling. So that's covering the object or filling it if it's volume. And then the operation is the important part. It's going to all polygons at the moment. And just to show you how we can change this, we could have it go to just the polygon centers. So if I press play here, and this is where that topology will start to reveal itself. So you can see if I show the geometry again, now it should be polygon centers. Now I've got it in isopalm mode. And what that means is it's showing me, if I uncheck this, that's the unsubdivided geometry. But when obviously I'm subdividing, but it's still displaying the same number of divisions. That's just called isopalm. We just go to display and change it to wireframe. And you can see we get one particle to the center of each of those polygons. And we could obviously, at this point, we could have the emitter kind of fade off. So say around about 130 is the last frame we emit on. It won't fade, it'll just stop. And once we feel like we've got enough coverage, there we go. So immediately this is showing itself to reveal a logo based on the geometry. It's hidden because we're hiding the actual geometry, gives the illusion that it's being constructed by the emitter and this cover modifier, which is really cool. Okay, so let's just run through a few of these other options here. We won't be using many of these. In fact, we're going to move away from the cover modifier, and I'll explain that later. I just wanted to show all the different ways we can do that. Well, I'm never going to show you all the ways, but as many ways as possible that I think are suitable for this. Here's nearest point. Now, we'll probably need to reduce the number of particles for this one. So basically, wherever the emitter is, it'll just find the nearest point on the surface and attach itself. Oh, let's continue to emit in all frames. There we go. You can see as I move the emitter around, that could be quite a cool effect. But it's going right to the edge, because if we look at the geometry, I've actually got this sort of pillowed, sort of inverted pillow effect here. So it's actually cutting in, and the closest points are these pronounced edges. So it goes to those. And if I put the emitter, if I actually reset the emitters, just do that. Put it here, the closest points will be those four inner points there. So that's pretty cool. That might be suitable for some scenarios. It's not going to be for ours, but that's cool anyway. And let's quickly check the other ones. There are a few options in that, by the way, that you can kind of increase the attraction. Increase the threshold of which polygons it goes to and that kind of stuff. It's really cool. If I just demonstrate something actually, if I go back to all polygons, and we can actually use a selection. So it won't work with our STS, or it might do, but I'll just demonstrate without the STS. Now, if I've got a selection, and I've got a few on these, I've got the front fascia there. I've got a few other ones. That's a duplicate, it looks like. This is just when I was modeling this. Obviously, I created some selections, so we'll just use this one. Could be any. If we go to the cover modifier, and you'll see there's the selection option. If I click on selection whilst we're in one of the polygon modes, let's hide the geometry again. And let's make sure that the geometry is changed to that. And there we go. Now that's only affecting or only targeting that selection. And obviously that's really useful if you've got an object with multiple items. So say we just want it to go on the central item. Well, we just select that and set selection. And it's polygon selection. Let's call it inner logo. Now all we need to do is link that up to this selection here. Press play. Let's hide it again. And you see it only goes to the inner logo. Maybe we wanted one set of particles to go to the inner part and then another to another set. So that's kind of cool because it allows us to have real control over where it's going to go onto our model. But I don't need that. Let's get rid of that again. And let's just jump through a few more of these. Now this one's cool. So using visible polygons. Now I'm going to reveal the mesh again. Let's actually pause and let's reveal the geometry. And let's make sure that I've assigned this piece of geometry back here. Now I'm jumping back and forth, having to change the geometry here. So the target object, each time I need to change it, if I'm doing the reveal type, let's put that in there. And let's go back to all polygons. So that's going to now reveal our type instead of the logo. We can obviously hide the logo. Now that's cool, but the problem is if we have a scene where we're going to be swapping out the logo a lot, this can get a bit laborious. So a little trick here is to actually use a sort of like a parent piece of geometry that will connect them all up and then be able to just swap whatever becomes a child of that object will become our emitter source or our cover object source. So it doesn't matter what it works for modifiers, emitters, whatever takes a geometry source, add a connect object. And we can drag it down here. And let's call it logo geometry. There we go. And let's link that up with our cover modifier. And now what this means is whatever a child of this is, in fact, I'm going to turn off welding as well. Sometimes you might want that, but I find that adds extra processing that it doesn't always need. So turn that off. And it can also disrupt the mesh as well if it eats away at it. But there we go. So now that's still working. If I now take that out and swap it for our reveal type, that's a much quicker way for me now to swap in new geometry and new logos and stuff. So let's go back to our logo. That means we won't have to faff with that anymore. And we're going to go back to that using normals, the visible polygons. Now this is probably going to be easier to demonstrate if I move the emitter down and under. So there we go, like somewhere like that. Let's make it really small. Let's make a super fine point there. And as it emits, you'll see that it's only emitting on the surfaces that are visible to the emitter. And what it means by that, it literally means that if, imagine you've got the camera here, we turn the geometry on, basically any of these surfaces that are visible to the emitter, they will get the particles. And you can see we've got a pretty good coverage from this angle. But if I swing round, you'll see that they're not going on to the back surfaces or the undersides. However, it is going through other geometry. So you can see there, even though this bit of geometry here is hidden to the emitter, that is actually still being added to that surface because it's just using a normal calculation. So it's saying if this surface is facing the emitter, it's a target surface to cover. There is a way to sort of fix that though, or not necessarily fix, there's just an alternative way that does allow you to occlude the particles. Let me increase the number as well actually. So jump to the emitter. This is a common thing when you're in a project, you're jumping back and forth from emitter and modifier just to kind of tweak and test some settings. There we go. So that's the normal mode and it's covering all the surfaces. Now if we go back to the cover mod and change the operation to using rays and we press play. Now this is a bit of a heavy operation, but it's you can see it's still really quick. However, what we're getting now is we're getting occlusion. So it's like a shadow almost. So if I zoom in to be in the same position as the emitter, you can see we're seeing an even coverage. But then if I swing the camera around, you'll see that it's occluded like a shadow. So it's like a collision system, but it's not quite the same as a collision system. But it allows, well, the rays are creating a collision surface, but they are just telling the cover modifier where it can cover and where it can't. And if there's no line of sight to the surface, it won't allow particles to go there. So that's pretty handy. One way of revealing the logo, you could animate so if I hide the logo actually, you can actually animate the emitter moving around. I can just interactively move it for now just to demonstrate. And you can see it's almost like spray painting it to reveal it like that. That's cool. But if I go to the back side, we won't have many particles on there. So we'd have to swing the emitter around and give it some coverage on the back side as well. Okay, so that's the ray, sort of the visible polygons modes. Now, the next one I'd like to show is how it can work with points rather than the polygons. So let's do vertices. Now this is going to give us a similar look to the center polygons. And if I press play here, you'll see our particles, or let's, I was moving our cover modifier instead of our emitter there. So put that back to 0. Let's move our emitter back out here. And you can see we're emitting onto the vertices of the object. So if I show that SDS, let's go to a wireframe mode. Now I've got shortcuts for this, but you could always go to display, and then that's garage shading with lines. And you can see there's a particle per point. You see it's just sitting on there. Well, actually there's multiple particles. So I'm overloading it with particles in the sense that there are more particles than there are points. So it'll just keep cycling through them randomly. And if you notice, the emitter just randomly sends the particles to a random point on the surface. And that's because the default mode is this object vertices random. We can do it ordered, and I'll explain that in a second. Now, it's going to look a bit weird. You can see it's kind of cycling through. Now, if we drop the emitter's rate down really low, let's hide that geometry again. Let's make it like 50, maybe 100, we'll see. But you can see it's kind of a cool system where it actually follows the polygon order, or the point order, I should say. And by point order, if you've never done any polymodeling or had to deal with this before, even if you have done polymodeling, you might not have come across this. Essentially, a mesh is made up of these points, these vertices, and they have a specific order. So if I actually turn this off, click on our XP logo geometry, and you can see if we click on a point here, And then in your Cinema 4D layout, by default, there's this structure tab. And this will actually reveal this whole list of things. And you can change the mode and the view, what you're viewing. And we're currently viewing the points, that's correct. If I scroll down, you can see there's just thousands of points. And in fact, I just went past our point there, I think. Yeah, so this point here is the 4,642 index. But if I go back here and click on O, and then 1, 2, 3, and then you could just keep going through them. Now, if you watch the particles, they will come to this 0 point first. So if I press play, oops, oh, it's because I've disabled our geometry there. So there we go. Let's hide the geometry, but you can see where my selection still is. That is the first point that it goes to. So that's pretty handy. Like if you want to create, but mostly that would be used for FUI stuff. I think, you know, it's kind of zipping up and building your logo in an ordered fashion, and it looks really cool. And the beauty of it being a modifier is that we could have multiple emitters for this. So we could have another emitter, and we could move this one over here. We could even make it like a big round emitter. Let's zero out some of the coordinates here. Let's make it bigger than the actual geometry. And let's make it a ring emission only. Let's press play. And you can see, actually, I'll give them a different color so it's clear to see what's going on here. Nice pink color. There we go. So you can see both the sets of particles are attracting in order to that logo. Cool. There is another mode here called ordered random, which sounds a bit nonsensical, but what it means is that it's sending the particles out in a specific order, but they end up sort of randomly assigned to those ordered particles, ordered vertices. I'd recommend playing around with these just to see which one gives the look that you're after, basically. Okay, so the nearest vertex is similar to nearest surface point. It will just fire the particle to the closest vertex to the emitter. So you can see here, if I move this around, it'll just jump to the closest vertex on the surface. Again, could be really cool for generating some kind of FUI stuff. Let's clear our original emitter or second emitter away. And let's jump back to the cover, and we'll just do these final few here. Now, object volume, very similar to the surface modes. It will fill the volume instead of the... I need to add more particles, obviously. Let's go for 10,000. And there you go. You can see it's filling up the volume rather than just the surface. And it'd be quite cool. You can combine them, obviously. You could have another system with a surface covered mode, and that would look quite interesting. You know, you can have different colored particles on the outside and then the volume ones on the inside there. Okay, that's cool. And the last mode is texture mode. Now, we're not going to be using this too much, but this is also pretty cool. So if I add a material and I throw it on top of our logo geometry here, and let's just create a noise. It could be any kind of texture, but noise is a nice straightforward one to demonstrate this mode. Let's give it, actually let's do blistered turbulence. That's kind of got a bit more of a natural edge to it. I'm going to clip it quite hard so that we can see the exactly what's going on here. So I created this material. In the color channel, I've added this noise. I could have added it to the luminance channel, but I'll demonstrate what we can do with this. So I'm just going to make sure that's assigned to the geometry. It is. Let's show the geometry. Now, if you've had experience with noises in Cinema 4D, you'll know that probably isn't the accurate representation of it. It's actually the UV distribution, and that's based on the UV I have on here. If I shift double click this UV, you'll see that's what we've got. And that's what xParticles will actually look at, is the UV. And this might be a good representation of it, we'll see. Cover mode is in texture, and we just need to make sure we get the texture tag, and it's this one here. And we'll just leave it on this for now. And the color channel that we're using at the moment is color. In the distribution channel, we can actually use a different one. But by default, if I just let this flow onto the surface and I hide the mesh, we can see it's attracting, but it's only attracting to areas where there is white white in the shader. And that's based on this threshold as well. We could clamp it even more, or we could use specific colors for it to target, that kind of thing. So it's really cool. If I click blend color, that'll actually morph the color of the particles, and you can see we've got that there. And this is where the two separate distribution and color channels come in handy, because if I go to I'll set the distribution by the color channel. Actually, no, let's do color channel by color and distribution by luminance. And what that means is jump into the color channel here. Let's just duplicate our noise. Actually, no, let's create a new noise. So activate our luminance. I don't think you even need to activate the channels. What XP does is if you've told it to look for a shader or a color in this channel, it doesn't matter whether it's activated or not, it will find it and use it. So it's quite intelligent that way. So we'll add another noise. Let's create some pretty obvious obvious colors that aren't green. Oh wow, they really aren't unpleasant colors there. So let's try. Yeah, okay, still pretty bad, but we'll let it slide because this is just a quick test. Give that a bit more contrast like that, and let's shrink the size right down. It doesn't really matter what the material looks like because we can hide that. Well, the geometry is hidden, so it doesn't matter. So now we've got the distribution. Oh, I've done it the wrong way around, haven't I? So I actually put the color into here. What I'm going to do, I'm going to click copy shader, go to the color channel, drag that shader into the luminance like that. Then I'm just going to click this arrow and paste that into there. Go back to our cover modifier, and yep, so color and luminance for the distribution. So you'll see here now the color's changing based on our color channel, and that's a different noise and different size. And just to demonstrate that, let's shrink the noise even further. There we go. And the distribution though is still that white and black noise in the luminance channel. All right, so that's a rundown of the cover modifier. Now there are a few limitations to the cover modifier. Once it's attached to the object, it actually has a freeze flag on the particles, so you have to find a way to unstick them, and it's fine, but it's just it might limit things if you want to have other modifiers interfering with the particles on the surface. So depending on your use case, it might not suit. Currently, there's different modes that I'm using here for the speed and velocity, and I said I'd talk about that, so I will. Now, acuteness of turn, what that means is if I've got the particles, you can see if I give them quite a high speed, like so. Maybe let's go really crazy. Let's go 1,000. Oh, too far, too much for the thing to capture them. So let's drop that back down. Let's upset it a bit. There we go. And if I go to the acuteness of turn, now if I drop this, you can see it's almost like an attraction value or a strength value for our cover modifier. So if you want it to just snap straight to the object or go very straight to the object, you'll have it at a high acuteness of turn. But if you want it to look a bit more natural, you have it at a low value, and the default is 50% on the cover modifier. And currently we're using the particle speed. So whatever the particle speed is, they will approach the surface at that speed. But what if we want to have it occur in a specific time? Well, there's a mode for that. So we can change the speed mode to set time to reach target. And it's set at default to 90, which is 3 seconds in my project. If I set it to higher, obviously it's going a bit quick. There we go. And this is more evident if I use a shot mode. So if I go to the emitter, go to the emission tab, shot mode. Let's do 10,000 particles. And there we go. That's more than that actually. Let's do 100,000. And there we go. They will move there in a specific time frame. So let's say it's 60 frames. And there we go. If I pause 60 frames, it's fully arrived and snapped to its cover target. Okay, so that's really useful when you want to do kind of very specific timings, and you can give it a bit of variation there, you see. That's really cool. Okay, so what else have we got in here? We've got gravity mode. Now, I very rarely use this, but it essentially just treats the attraction as a gravity. So instead, it's like an acceleration rather than just... and you can see how quick that can be. If I increase gravity strength, it'll go past. There we go. You can see it kind of orbits until it kind of gets closer in and in. And we've actually reached a nice equilibrium there. So that might be useful in some scenarios. If you're trying to cover a logo, that's probably not the best mode to use. So, you know, time to reach or use particle speed is probably the most natural sort of interesting modes. But also, I wanted to talk about how these modifiers work. And this is one of the limitations, is how it works with other modifiers. So if I add an XP Turbulence, XP Turbulence, and we just let this play, you'll note that the particles are in a very strict sort of shape. You see, they're not actually being affected by the turbulence. If we have the cover modifier in force mode, velocity mode, I should say, is to default, it is setting the position of the particles. So velocity being the direction and speed of the particle rolled into one. And it doesn't really blend well with the other modifiers. So what we can do is we can put it into force mode, and then the turbulence will have much more of an effect, but then we'll also have a slightly weirder, more natural approach for the covering itself. So there's a balance to be had here. But that's pretty cool looking. And I think that covers the... Oh, that was definitely a deliberate pun there. That covers the cover modifier, and we're going to move on to another option. There is... Oh, I should just say one more thing as well, is that there is a sort of tolerance point, which is like how close it gets to the object before the particles will stick to it. And this can look kind of artificial. This is one of the limitations I find of the cover modifier, but it's not always apparent. Let me put it back to velocity mode. And what it does is once the particles get within range, they'll actually jump to the surface. So currently at 10, it's really imperceptible. But if we use, let's change back to particle speed, use braking, and what the braking does, oh, that's a bit fast. Let's go back to 150. There we go. And as it arrives at the target, you see it sort of slows down, it decelerates, and that's what this braking value is. However, you'll also notice, if I go frame by frame, it suddenly jumps. So it jumps to its location, and that's because it's within 10 units of its tolerance, or 10 units of its location. So we can drop that down, but the risk with that is that it won't capture the particles. So if the value is too small, the cover modifier won't be able to capture the particles, and they'll end up sort of loosely approaching the surface and then never... If you look here, so if eventually they all arrive, that's perfect. But some still remain loose. So there's a bit of a balancing act here, but there are the options to tweak all this stuff out, which is great. So, okay, we've looked at the cover modifier. I'm pretty, happy that that's pretty well explored. And what we're thinking about is more control over exactly how our logo forming looks. So there's another way we can do this. We can actually use another modifier called the Inherit modifier. So let's go to modifiers, and this is actually under control modifiers because we're going to control the particles. So we go down here and we find xpInherit. And what this is going to do is this is going to actually use two emitters. So if I turn off our original emitter, let's just turn off some stuff. Let's turn off our turbulence as well. In fact, I'm just going to delete the turbulence so it can't interfere. And we're going to actually create a new emitter. And we're going to create this new emitter based off this geometry. We can get rid of that texture as well. So let's click on the logo geometry. And what a nice feature of xParticles is it has this command, which is emit from object. So we can find that if we just go into the search commands, you can either go emit from object, and you can see it comes up there. It's a command. It's like a tool, so a command. And you can go into, also you can find it in the quick tools. So it's called XP Quick Tools. And if you go to workflow, oh no, sorry, not workflow, it's just particle effects here. You can click on emit from object. So hit that there, and we get a nice emitter, and press play. Let's make the particles a bit more visible using squares. And let's take the speed off them completely. And you can see that's now emitting on that object. So that's a nice, really handy, quick way to emit onto a surface. Now, what we can do with this is we can have the first emitter that we have over here actually inherit the positions of this new emitter. So let's give it a different color, by the way. Let's make this one a nice pink color. And then what we could just say, instead of having it single color, we can just change the color mode to use emitter color icon. And there we go, just so that they're differentiated. Do you know what? I'm going to make that icon green just so it's the same. There we go. So if I change the color of the icon now, it'll change the color of the particles. Just helps a bit whilst we're managing things. And before color is particularly important. So let's just hide that second one there. And okay, so let's hide the geometry. And we're going to need way more particles than that to make it look interesting. So let's do a shot emission. And let's do 50,000 to start with. Press play and boom, we get those particles emitted straight away. And let's do the other emitter. Let's turn that on. Now it's over here at the moment. We could just move it down. Doesn't matter where it is really. If I press play now, nothing's going to happen. So because we've turned our modifiers off. So what we need to do is we need to turn our inherit modifier on, and we need to tell the inherit modifier which of these is the target, and it's this one here. So we drag that in there, and it will automatically add it to our modifier stack, and it'll exclude it as well. But it's kind of already naturally excluded within the modifier. So you can see here now, if I press play, go back to the beginning, we get this nice motion where it moves in to the surface. And the advantage of that is that we could actually have the emitted particles moving. So if I just give them like a really slow speed, you'll see the particles are arriving, but they're already being moved away. So that's pretty cool. And the other advantage of that is we can do these weighting and probability things. So let's not move the particles off for a minute. Now, as it gets closer and closer, it's going to inherit. So it's a bit more of an easing motion than it does with the cover modifier. And the probability is essentially what's the chance that a particle will be inherited. And you can see there's a bunch of them just didn't even bother. If I drop it right down, let's make the emitter a bit bigger so we can see which ones arrive and which ones don't. So you can see a bunch of the particles, a percentage of them, 7% of them inherited, and the rest didn't. If I increase that to 50, you'll see it pulls back 50% of the particles. There we go. So that's another way of doing this. And the advantage, one of the big advantages of this is we can inherit loads of stuff from the target particles. So we could inherit the color. So if they have a target color, let's make the probability 100%. Let's leave the weight on full. And there we go, it can inherit the color. So if we had it emitting from a texture, for instance, and it could inherit a much more complicated texture, that would be cool as well. But that's the other way of covering or revealing a logo like this. And as always, this is all procedural, so we can pull this XP logo out and hide it. And let's drop the type one in, and I press play, and it now reveals that one. So that's keeping it all nice and procedural with this connect object. Let's go back to our logo. Excellent. Okay, so now I've shown you these two ways to cover our object and to reveal it from sort of nothing. We could even, morph from one emitter to another. So I should show you that actually. That's another advantage of this inherit mode, is that we could actually emit from another object. So if I hide this emitter, and let's just use this piece of geometry. So we'll use the reveal object. So let's move that over here, up here, and hide that. And let's do another emit from object. So let's run the emit from, and that's created another emitter again. Let's set that one up with squares, and let's press play. And now you can see, if I let's emit way more particles than that. So you can see I'm actually pulling it off the other if I stop it at 30 frames or something, you can see we can transfer and morph objects one from another. And if I put that reveal back to 0, and just right click these, there we go, you can see it can morph from one shape to the next. So that's really cool. And possibly a little bit more controllable than cover in some scenarios, but cover has other advantages like those really cool ray modes and polygon orders and stuff like that. So it really depends on what you're after. One particular mode that the cover can't do is it can't do like a volume fill in a voxel fashion. So if we take our target, which is this one, and in fact let's do that and go object, change it from polygon area to voxel grid, and let's just see what that looks like. Let's hide our, well, we can just let it go. Let's see. And there we go. It fills it in a grid fashion. I mean, that grid is way too large at the moment. There we go. Again, that would be quite cool for FUI. You see it you get these nice aligned particles. Okay, so we've had a good look at xpInherit and xpCover modifiers, where we're covering objects with different algorithms and all that cool stuff, and then inheriting particle positions from another emitter. And they're great and useful for certain scenarios. But for our scenario, where we're creating a logo, I'm creating it from sort of a nebular sort of shape. I'm actually going to go for a different technique, and I think perhaps a slightly overlooked one. And we're going to continue that in the next video, but essentially we're going to look at exploding the particles off the shape, then reversing the sim and having them form the logo in reverse. Okay, so I'll see you in the next video.